Okay, we have 30 minutes. And I really urge everybody in the audience to participate from the get-go. Don't wait for 10 minutes into the panel to start asking questions. Start asking questions as soon as you feel you want to get something in. And just to start to set a pace for this panel, I always like to start with a quick fire round. Just to help our panel members to relax because they all look a bit nervous. And just to make sure that you sort of get into a tempo as well. So we're going to get personal to start with. It's always a great way to break the ice. Let's start with, and I'm going to ask you each question. I want you to answer in as few words as possible. Even, one word would be great, but just a few words. And I'm going to go around, bam, 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 and then so on and so forth for about 3 or 4 questions. Martin, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll come round to Jules and then Dan. So I want you to first start us off by telling us, personally, what's your greatest ESG achievement that you're most proud of?
For me, the greatest achievement on ESG from the past year is the onboarding of the teams, and so getting all the hotel teams in our hotels part of the ESG story of the company, and not just a corporate book that we have somewhere, but we really have the people on board. That's, I think, the most important thing of the past year.
For you, personally?
Yes.
Well, I could do it in 2 words, but it'll be a bit misleading. It's just smart meters. It's a bit misleading because I'm not sure I can take credit for their existence. But so to expand, in a previous role, we rolled out smart meters across the entire office portfolio that we were looking after. And just the act of giving greater visibility to the tenants about what energy they were using, as opposed to just making them pay a share of the overall building energy. In many cases, we were cutting energy usage by 35% in those buildings, and I think that's extraordinary that there are some really good, simple things you can do that make a big difference.
For me, it's setting up an ESG and sustainability consultancy from scratch with zero experience. And that may be something that I shouldn't admit to in a room full of potential clients. But my background is very much student housing. I run student housing consultancy, but I also run an ESG consultancy. I founded that 4 years ago, seeing a gap in the market, but also out of a trip to India. Doesn't everybody always go to India and find themselves? But I very much found myself looking to solve a problem, trying to give a commercial solution. So yeah, effectively setting up from scratch with zero understanding of the market. I should just say my business partner's an environmental scientist, so that does help.
And have you since actually got up to speed and got some learning under your belt?
Very much so, yes. I'm typically the one trying to close the deals, so I have to know what I'm talking about. So, yeah, although I'll probably get found out here, we'll soon see.
I was going to say, we're about to find out.
Okay, let's get a little more personal. What are you least proud of? Don't get too personal. ESG focus, okay? Just tell me what you are least proud of when it comes to ESG.
The least proud, I think, is...
And by the way, just to save you some grace, this could be a reflection on your organization.
Yeah,
because
for me,
ultimately we're all learning, aren't we?
Of course, it's personal, but it's also from the organization as a whole. I think what we're not so proud of is sometimes that we have ideas, and I think that was why I also used it as the biggest achievement, that we have some big projects that we want to launch, we make a whole thing about it, we launch it, and then we hope that everybody down the line is going to follow and is going to do it. And well, we had some bad examples where that was not the case, and where all the ideas were very good, but at the end it didn't work out, and it didn't. The message was never passed on to the teams, and the teams were not using it. And then you can make whatever corporate strategy that you want to have on an ESG side, but on the floor it's not working. And for me, that's for me really a reflection of the past years. Okay. From the beginning, and when we want to launch something, how are we going to make sure that we get the buy-in from all the teams, and how can we make them part of the project? Because otherwise, you know from scratch that everything you will do will never lead to what you were hoping for.
How can you do that? Tell us, because they always say culture eats strategy for breakfast. Mm-hmm. They also say that success, 5% of success is strategy, 95% is mindset. So how do you change the mindset? And on top of that, they say, people don't like to be changed. They may like change, but they don't want to be changed. So how do you do that as a company?
I think on one side you can use the knowledge that you have. I mean, if ESG, the topic as a whole, there's a lot of people that are very interested in it, and there's also a lot of employees on the floor that are very interested in the topic. But there's also a lot of them that they're not really against it, but they're also not the biggest fan of it. And I think you can use the ones that are really passionate about it, and to use their passion and to use their passion about it, and to make them see how small things can make a big difference if you multiply it by a lot of people or by a lot of hotels. What that could do. And so for me, using the ones that are really motivated from themselves, so that you don't need to work on their motivation or why they want to do it. No, to use those to actually convince the other employees in the hotel that are perhaps a little bit more blurry about it. And that's, well, I don't want to say don't care, but are not as involved as the ones that are really involved in these type of topics.
Mm. So before we start diving too much into implementation, let's just stick with this, things that you're least proud of. Jules, what are you least proud of? Tell us a little bit about McKinsey & Company. Give us a bit of a trade secret.
I am not going to stand on stage to answer that question in front of the camera directly. So the thing that this will feel slightly tangential to ESG, I think, but I believe it's deeply fundamental to achieving success in this area. And I guess the area that I'm least proud of is I feel I've spent the last, decade or so trying really hard to get different parts of the real estate industry to collaborate with each other, particularly in the area of data, creating shared data standards that we can use to enable us to onboard buildings and share data between each other faster, to just work together to share data, to collaborate, to understand the situation better. And it's really, really difficult. I definitely do not feel I have in any way succeeded in that drive. And so this is partly, I guess, my failure, and partly the failure, I think, of the entire industry. Everyone in this room, and everyone outside this room that works in this industry as well, we have got to get better at this if we're going to achieve anything with ESG, I think.
I think it's a really interesting point. You guys had an opportunity. You could have gone to the data session, or you could have come here. I mean, depending on your outlook, they both might be sort of dry old ships, but I'm very much glad you're here. But I think we've got to make sure that we are not using too much of the stick, and we're using the carrot, and we're not sort of berating people for not being too far along the line, and making sure we're encouraging them. And that is one of the problems that I think we have, that I have certainly as a consultant. I can go in and say, right, we need to review what you're doing. They're like, we're doing nothing so far. That's fine. We can start from wherever. Don't then sort of berate them and say, yeah, you've got to hit absolutely up to here. My balance needs to be finding that sort of commercial level. How focused is this client on the balance sheet ultimately, and making sure that you can align their ESG criteria that they need to hit, etc., along with their business goals as well. So it's really sort of fitting that gap. I don't think I've got that balance right enough yet. And I think that's probably my biggest disappointment so far.
Theoretically, that sounds good. I'm going to pick on someone in the audience. Michelle, you and I were speaking just before this panel, weren't we, about this particular topic. We were talking about hotel management agreements. We were talking about franchise agreements. We were talking about resistance from some players on the value chain. How are we going to crack this?
I think you're right when you talk about a carrot and a stick approach. I think there's got to be both. Some people, it's just not going to be important. So for some people, it's just not going to be important to them. So for them, a stick is possibly quite helpful, combined with a carrot, if perhaps it saves them money, or it gives them some better reputation, or it drives people towards the business, and they will need to see that they're going to get some returns from doing this, or that there'll be consequences if they don't do it. And then, as you were saying, sometimes you can use people who are really committed to it to bring others along. And I think you've just got to have a combination of strategies. There's not one answer, and you have to keep continually evolving.
So just pass the mic one row back to Rekha Tura from JLL. Let's talk about this return on investment. What's happening with valuations? When are we going to start seeing ESG actually filtering through into valuations? Because that's a pretty big carrot, isn't it, Rekha?
Where's the green premium, ultimately? That's what we want to know.
I mean, are we talking about a green premium, or are we talking about a brown discount?
Both.
I mean, it's much of a
Both.
muchness.
Does
what
it
we're
matter?
talking
It's
about.
the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
This is
it's
exactly
the
the
same
point.
thing.
It is the same thing, and that we are actually seeing that filtering through into transactions already. And actually, investors are learning. I'm starting to see more instances of investors saying, okay, it's got BREEAM excellent, so therefore I am going to pay a little bit more. It's a bit like green finance in the sense that you get a reduction in your interest rate, but it's not that significant. But that pricing disparity is going to get bigger over time. And actually, it's interesting because I've just been working on a very large Nordics portfolio, and they refinanced a couple of hotels in there, and actually they ended up getting an even lower margin, and part of that was driven by the fact that they got the BREEAM excellent accreditation. But there's also obviously a lot more focus on what will the next buyer be looking at from a pricing perspective? What do we need to consider? Because even if the valuers have not yet reflected that in a valuation, the fact that one hotel is not as efficient as another, the credentials are not so great. At the end of the day, the next buyer is more likely to be looking at that. And that's not just the larger funds, you'll be looking at the owner-operator universe as well.
Great,
There's a lot
thank
more
you.
I can say, but it's just
Thank
in
you,
a
Ragnar.
nutshell.
So I'm going to come back to you then, Daniel. Tell us, how are you advising your clients in this area? How can they, how are they being positioned by yourselves to really focus and make sure that they're going to get that premium on value in the next sale?
Take action. It really is quite simple. The answers are already out there. It just depends on how far you're willing to push it, both in terms of financially and the resource that takes as well. There is, our largest operator, Unite, is divesting away from core. So they're basically selling off anything in a tier 2 city, but they're also selling off the assets that are going to be stranded pretty soon. And those assets, they're not doing anything with them from a sustainability standpoint. They're just sort of flowing down the deal chain, as it were. And new investors, new developers are kind of picking them up, don't really know exactly what to do with them. Some of them are starting to make more sustainability plays, and that will add value. And I think there's a huge opportunity in that value add play there, because there is definitely a green premium to be had on older stock that can be repurposed, refurbished, and have that sustainability capex play put into it. But I don't think we're seeing, in student accommodation in particular, but also across various other sectors too, that we work across from an ESG front, I don't think we're seeing anywhere near enough action that is laddering up to either SBTI, so your Science-Based Targets Initiative, whereby you're focusing on company net zero targets, etc. I think there's a bit of a lazy assumption that BREEAM very good is okay. It's not. Your asset, if it's BREEAM very good now, in 5 years' time, will probably be stranded. You need to be looking at BREEAM outstanding, at the very least BREEAM excellent. And it's just constantly moving that along. And this is the thing, it's not that I can go into an investor or a developer client now and say, here you go, here's the answers, this is 50 years worth of actions, etc. It is constantly evolving. So that's why you need the experts, in-house or externally, to be able to tell you at any given time what you need to do to make sure that you're pushing that sort of the potential stranded assets further down the line, because it will keep changing, keep evolving.
So just to be clear, has Unite accepted a brown discount on those assets that they're not going to do anything about, which are going to be stranded? Or are they not even being, challenged with a brown discount in the market? What's happening there?
I couldn't possibly say. And ultimately, there is definitely an element where it doesn't fit in with the business plan, because these assets will end up stranded, or they're in tier 2 cities that the universities may struggle. Therefore, we'll just get rid of them. We don't really need to talk about them. We've done okay on them. And I think, personally for me, I would like to see much more work before sale to get it up to scratch, to make sure that each asset, even if it's sold, is BREEAM excellent or whatever. Only then are we going to start to see that there is a green premium, not necessarily a brown discount. So, yeah, it's not an easy situation for any investor that is looking to divest. Of course, you don't really want to spend money on assets that you're going to get rid of. But I think there's a moral obligation for operators, investors, developers to be looking at that, to future-proof the brand as well.
And I think I agree very strongly with what you said about just act. It seems to me that across this whole industry, outside hotels, across the whole real estate industry, this is a very, very fragmented industry in terms of skill sets, knowledge, sub-asset classes, and in pockets all over the place. There is some really excellent activity going on, but we're not as good as we could be, I think, at joining the dots between all of that. So in very many cases, I think we see with our clients that there are some obvious and immediate quick wins that you can achieve, and just getting on with those feels generally like a very good idea. But that said, I think that beyond that, it becomes actually quite challenging. And what we're seeing is that for a lot of people, particularly if you're in particularly large portfolios, there are two very, very difficult challenges to mapping, for example, a pathway to net zero or something like that. And the first one is an informational challenge, knowing actually what you have to do across hundreds of buildings, all of the probably 100 different capital interventions you're going to need to make across hundreds or thousands of buildings. That, you know, there's a large number of things you have to know, and each of those are quite complicated. And then the other challenge is then the computational challenge of what do you do in what order? Even if you manage to get your list of this is for across all of those buildings, all of the things you have to do, how on earth do you run that through some kind of financial model that the C-suite can engage in and sign off on that says, I promise you, this is the most effective pathway to net zero. Of all the moving all of those different parameters over the next, whatever it is, 8 years, what is the most efficient pathway? Those are two non-trivial challenges that I think we face. That once you've done the quick wins, all the rest of it is actually quite challenging from an computational perspective.
So Jules is talking about net zero and identifying that as the key priority. Is that true for Accor Invest, Martin, or are you looking broader than that?
I think on one side, the first thing that triggered, but well, you said in your story, went slightly different. But the first comment that you made, I was kind of shocked. Okay, we're selling off, and then then of course for that partner, the on the books issue is solved because the stranded assets will no longer be there, but the stranded assets will still be there. So they're still out there, and somebody else is operating it who's probably not a very ESG. How do you say that? An ESG-driven company who's actually buying it. On the other hand, as you said later on, they can make a plan to get it de-stranded. So for me, I think it's more about how can we make sure that we actually do better as a whole, and selling an asset that has not the right ESG criteria. Well, very often it can be linked to other criteria as well. So potentially there is other reasons to sell it, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't sell them, but I think we should look at a broader picture, and we're going to make sure that on every investment that we do, we keep it into account, and I think that's something that you were asking about Accor Invest that we are working on. Now for every project that is going to be brought to the investment committee, there's a current score that we have on ESG and the score that we're aiming for after the project. And of course, that was already the case for, you're going to change the heat system to a heat pump. Well, it was clear an ESG project, so they had, what does it do for ESG? But also if you're now going to do a room refurbishment, we're going to look, what's going to happen? What's the current score that we have? What's the impact on the environment that we're going to make? Are we going to use sustainable products? Can we reuse the products if there's the end of life of that room product? And all that is taken into consideration. And I think that's the way to change, and that's the way to bring the hospitality as a whole to the next level. But then, you were also making some comments about comparing. It's still very difficult to compare because yes, there's all the different certifications, but we also know that some of the certifications, it's more like a tick the box exercise. Yeah. So it's, I think it's still something, and then relating to the data, I think there's still something to be done to have it comparable between all different parties that are out there and the different players that are working in the industry.
I think we could simplify all of this, like everybody in the room could do as much as they possibly can. Like I do think we have a moral obligation to go as far as we possibly can from an ESG standpoint to minimise impacts, etc., and make sure that we have a positive impact on people, planet, all of the usual stuff that you would expect an ESG consultant to say. I think that in this case with Unite, for example, I think they had an obligation to, and anybody looking to divest an opportunity or an asset has a moral obligation to make sure that that is the highest possible level of sustainability. And if not, that anyone coming in buying that asset isn't just completely clueless, and it's not just capital whereby they're just going to sit and hold it and do absolutely nothing to it and then flip it on at some point. I think you've got to look to get someone involved, mandate in your contract, in your purchase contract, that they have to get that, and you could even put bonus clauses in and say, like, yes, we'll give you an exit clause whereby we'll pay you X amount based on the BREEAM score, for example, that you achieve after you've implemented those new potential CapEx things. That's quite a naive way of looking at things, but I do think that the larger firms, Uniter PLC, and various other firms as well, have that, I think there's that real obligation that they do have to make sure that the standard is high for anything that they divest as well.
Sorry, Tom, I have to pick on you on this one. Please enlighten us on this one. That sounds to me like a bit of pie in the sky, but how realistic is that?
I tend to agree. I think I can see buyers being very reluctant to take on that type of commitment. And I don't disagree that it's slightly sort of burying your head in the sand to say, I'm going to improve my ESG credentials by simply divesting the stuff that doesn't, that drags down my average. And that I'm improving because I'm simply getting rid of the lower stuff rather than actually increasing the performance of my assets. So I completely agree with that point. And I agree that it's right that people should be taking more responsibility for the assets they're selling as well as the ones that they're keeping if they have a true ethos and strategy of achieving a net zero pathway. But I think in reality, in that type of transaction, I think it's going to be very hard to impose those types of obligations on a buyer, and you'll find yourself with a very limited pool of bidders if that's the condition of the deal.
And also, why shouldn't ESG be a financial driver? Why is it not being considered purely in financial terms? My organization feels very strongly that ESG is all about finance. That's the way that we all have to approach it. Paul Slattery, I could see Paul's hand up at the back. Paul, you have a question?
Thank you. Thanks, Sophie. Is it a greater priority for operational real estate to be sustainable than to be physically secure?
Are you referring to climate resilience? When you
Sorry?
say secure? When you say secure, do you mean
Physically
climate resilience?
secure.
Physical risks?
That the property is in integrity.
Okay.
I'll put it another way, a question for Martin. What proportion of the Accor Invest properties are physically secure?
And how do you mean the term physical secure?
That the property is intact. Structural integrity. Yeah.
And from a building safety perspective, you mean? Well, I think the building safety is something that what is checked on a regular basis, and if there's things that are not correct or not compliant, we're changing them. So I'm not completely understanding the question, but for me, so yes, the portfolio that we own, if there's structural issues with, we will correct them. On the other hand, if we make the link towards ESG, are all the are all the hotels already having the highest rating in ESG? No, there's a big difference in some hotels that are very environmental friendly and where we really have a lot of things in place, and others where those investments are not yet fully made in all the properties. And I think that's a general thing in the entire industry, that there's a difference between older hotels and new hotels. But I'm not 100% sure if that answered your question, but...
I work with investor clients on a daily basis, and I think that they would probably prioritise it financial viability of any scheme or any building, first and foremost. Second, compliance, which I think is what you're talking about when it comes to physical security, whether it be Building Safety Act, fire regs, or whatever it might be, or the actual physical structure of the building. And then thirdly, sustainability. I do think there is,
Yeah, we have the situation in which now, no little credit to UFI, that companies have to announce what they've done on their ESG front. Mm-hmm. They do not have to announce what they've done about the physical security of their buildings. Okay? There is a growing catalogue of catastrophes worldwide, and within hotel companies like Accor, but not only Accor, far from it. Everybody has it. Mm-hmm. But It's not announced.
I think we have time for just one more question before we start wrapping up, because time flies. So I'm looking at the audience. I did see another hand up. Rekha, did you have your hand up? Did you want to comment on this building? Yep.
Just to your point about are investors considering it from a financial perspective, the answer is yes, they definitely are. They see it as a massive opportunity, but the issue is, how do they go about underwriting and how do they approach it? And the key to that is to share examples of how that is being done cross-sector in operational real estate. But there's a massive opportunity in operational real estate to drive those financial returns. And we're seeing these funds being raised, brown to green, et cetera. A lot of that is happening. But partly, I think investors just need to be brave and start to, sharpen those yields on exit. We're starting to look at that for interest rates. We know interest rates are on a downward trajectory now. Now the conversation has shifted 12 months from last year to say, actually, I am starting to reduce my yield on exit, whereas you might have kept it the same or increased it before. So in the sustainability space, we are starting to see that gradual shift, but there's a lot of learning that needs to be done.
An observation that maybe links a few of those different points is that I've noticed over the last couple of years that people have started adding a fourth letter to ESG, which I think fills some of this gap. And the ESG R, with R being resilience, or on the basis that, and I think I'm talking less about physical security. Have you got a security guard on the door? But there is a bit of that on the theory that although we have certainly the moral imperative to keep trying, it seems fairly clear that we're going to overrun some of the planetary boundaries at least, and therefore there is downside for all of us in climate change, and therefore not only do we have to build more sustainable buildings, but we have to build buildings that are resilient to the changes that are to come. And mostly I think people are writing about things like flood risk and temperature, but I suppose there is also a social aspect of that if there is going to be social upheaval, how do we make sure our buildings are resilient to that as well, which perhaps touches on the security point.
Fortunately, global reporting standards will require that as a mandatory requirement. So the IFRS, ISSB requirements have climate resilience very firmly embedded as one of the S1 and S2 reporting standards, and they are becoming mandatory. They have been adopted by many, many countries around the world. CSRD is completely interoperable with that, and it's already taking an effect. And I think by 2027 or 2028, we're going to see a complete transformation in the market, because by that time, many businesses, not only businesses that are operating in the European Union, but businesses, and I think Accor Invest, you know this very well. You really are in fifth gear on this, and I have to commend you as an organization in the work that you're doing in this area. But I think a lot of that is because in France, the French government has been very clear and said, if you don't, directors can be imprisoned. Yep. So now the stick is coming. So that's what's changing. So just very quickly, I don't know, we've got 1 minute. Andrew, I'm looking at you. Can we take another question here? A gentleman had his hand up. So the gentleman.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Go for it.
Let me get you a microphone. Yeah. No problem at all. Okay. Well, thank you. From an operator's perspective, when can we assume that ESG clauses will be in lease contracts or operational contracts? Because, from an operator perspective, a lot of the operators, at least us, we're not that big that we will be obliged to ESG reporting. Of course, we're looking into it, but so far we don't see it in the lease contracts as a real clause.
I think you have to do it. Like it's not mandated. But anybody that doesn't do it is going to get left behind. For me, I want to see complete transparency across every single person in this room, to be completely honest. You all should know exactly where you're up to on your ESG journey. No one really cares in the sense of we just want to know what your progress is going to be. You don't have to have a fully fledged strategy. You don't have to employ someone like me. You all know what your impacts are, collect that data, report on it, be open and honest and transparent and track that journey. That's genuinely all anyone really wants to see. And I think that's where there's a top-down approach and we need to push the bottom-up approach. And if we're not feeding the information through to the residents or our end users about what our impacts are, they can't necessarily vote with their feet well enough as to, actually, I'm going to go there because they're BREEAM excellent and they've got net zero targets or whatever it might be. That's coming. So, people will start voting with their feet. If you're being open and honest about where you're up to with your ESG and not necessarily just focusing on glossy brochure or a really pretty report, making sure that it's action-based, that is half the battle, because the investors are starting to demand a bit of that. Every investor client that I work with mandates that their operator has an ESG report, or at least an ESG strategy that they're reporting on a yearly basis. So it is coming. It's just a case of how quickly that's going to be. So I would say the onus is on every operator to really be dictating to investors and to their residents and tenants that, you know, where they're up to, where they're trying to get to.
Okay, last words, gentlemen. So, Jules, your last words in reaction not only to that, but also any final thoughts, because I think we have to wrap it up.
I'll add a quick thought to that. It probably ties back into what I said at the beginning. There's something here about collaboration as well. Anecdotally, I've heard quite often that landlords and tenants both actually quite want green clauses in their leases, and the lawyers, because it's not normal, and their job is to protect their client, block it. So just by pushing the lawyers out the room and having lunch,
I have to say, I'm not a lawyer, but we work with a lot of lawyers. I'm not quite sure that that's correct.
I've heard it an awful lot anecdotally. So just talk to each other. Let's all talk a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think the issue is that because this is an unprecedented change, and what I'm hearing is that everybody in the value chain is pointing fingers at the other players in the value chain and saying, well, X is blocking us and Y is blocking us, and actually it's the lawyer's fault now, or the brands are not reacting, or the owners are not responding to the brand. This is where we currently are. I think, I think it's actually one thing we have to all adopt is no judgment. We all have to unlearn, and we have to learn together. But the reality is that we're going to have to do this at pace now, because regulation is definitely clamping down on us. So Martin, as I said, I know Accor Investor in fifth gear on this. I'm a big fan of what you're doing. So you have the final word. Inspire the audience. Give them a nugget that they can take away as the final word to close this session and say, I actually got something to take away. I'm going to do this right now, because Accor Invest have proven and demonstrated that it works.
Well, thanks for all the compliments, but okay.
No pressure, huh?
No, but for me, and we didn't really discuss about it a lot today, but I think we should also not forget the S. So I want to end, because we didn't discuss the S of ESG today. What is, I think, also very important, the role that hospitality can play on the social part and on the training part. And I think that part is something that we all need to work on, because that will help for the hotels on our operational side to get things going and to use the things that we have and all the installations that we have in the hotel, to use them on the most efficient way. But at the same time, we're educating the people, which also will have an impact outside of the hotel. So for me, we were discussing a lot about reporting and what's going to be the ESG report and all that. Well, yeah, that will be in place. From next year, it will be compulsory. We already have those reports now, and I think we need to make sure that everybody within a company or everybody working in the real estate world in general is familiar with that and get to do their own little part of the bigger picture. So for me, that's what I would like to see happening in the coming year.
Wonderful. That's a great note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.